Are we started? As participants log on to the webinar, I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Judith Abitan. I'm the Executive Director of the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, and I'm speaking to you today from Montreal. The Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, in collaboration with our partners, Freedom House, the National Endowment for Democracy, China Digital Times, the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, the Canada Tibet Committee, the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, the Federation for a Democratic China, Hong Kong Watch, the Macdonald Laurier Institute, and Initiatives for China and the Nobel Women's Initiative present to you today a conference on a China at a crossroads, standing up for human rights during the pandemic. This conference brings together leading voices to discuss the human rights situation in China during the coronavirus pandemic, and will discuss three main themes. China's attempt to quarantine the truth and increasing threats against the media and journalists, China's political prisoners and mistreatment of minorities, identifying ways to hold the Chinese government accountable for the pandemic and human rights abuses. I will be moderating the first panel, and I'm delighted to have with us today a distinguished group of panelists. Xiao Zhang is the director and research scientist at Counter Lab at the University of Berkeley, California, and founder and editor of China Digital Times. Sarah Cook is the senior research analyst for China at Freedom House and director of the China Media Bulletin. And Christopher Walker is the vice president of studies and analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy. The CCP led a disinformation campaign about the rampant spread of COVID-19 through its massive state-sanctioned surveillance and suppression of data, misrepresentation of information, silencing and criminalizing of dissent, and the disappearance of whistleblowers, all of which reflect the breadth of criminality and corruption in the party. The first question is for Xiao. Xiao, to what extent can the CCP be held accountable for the initial cover-up of the COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan, the arrests and disappearances of doctors and dissidents, the extensive related censorship, disinformation campaign, and the use of surveillance technology?
Thank you, Judith, for the important event, and thank you for posing that important question. When this pandemic, even in the earliest stage, in early January, late January, we have already followed the Chinese social media closely. And at the time, there was a beginning of anxiety, of the fear, but also seeking for help and for lack of government information, and also the strong repression of online and media. The Chinese people at the time clearly knew that that was the fundamental factor that caused this epidemic went so large. So accountability, yes, but that voice is firstly heard from the Chinese people themselves. And let me give you some examples. But before I even go to that, let me start from 2 days ago. The Chinese the State Council of Information Office issued a white paper, listed the government narrative and their version of facts of what in China happened from the beginning until now about the pandemic. And here's something really interesting on the Chinese official media, that on Weibo, the foreign minister spokesperson Hua Chunying posted the following message about the white paper. She said that the history to combat against pandemic, it should leave a correct collective memory for all mankind. Just the Chinese government spokesperson said, the white paper of the government is leave a correct collective memory. And that comment on Chinese social media Weibo was immediately backfired by hundreds of posts, the comments, you can see it right now, that netizens are posting saying, who's correct collective memory? Who define correct? Can my memory be myself? What about Dr. Li Wenliang? Does he count it as an incorrect memory? Who is responsible to in charge of our memories? Now, let's go back to the beginning of the pandemic. Let's talk about the punishment of medical workers, including Dr. Li Wenliang, who are whistleblowers. Let's talk about how Chinese government muzzled citizen journalists like Chen Qiushi, Fang Bin, Li Zehua, to name a few. Let's talk about Chinese government arrested dissidents, quite suppressed political critiques. Let's name Xu Zhiyong and Ren Zhiqiang. And finally, Chinese government also censored public health information online. Because Xi Jinping is such a one-man rule, and China became far more authoritarian over the years, so the public space has been shrunk. Therefore, the local authority actually delayed and concealed information from the public. Even despite the early evidence of human-to-human transmission, when the medical staff became infected, this information did not get to the public for weeks. And that would not happen in a democratic country, which there's an open political system and will identify the outbreak earlier and also will inform its own public and the global community in a much more timely fashion. But that, unfortunately, did not happen in China. This delay to inform, also including the international organization like WHO. Well, I also want to say WHO failed its own responsibility to vet the information from the Chinese authority. Right? On the January 14th, the WHO had a tweet said, preliminary investigations conducted by Chinese authorities has found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus identified in Wuhan, China. But that was simply just compound on the Chinese government official information and a narrative. And this misinformation, allowing this lethal outbreak to sweep across the globe. Now, let's go to talk about what happened in China since January and February. The continuous suppression of any kind of speaking out and information about a pandemic. The Wuhan author Fang Fang, who has been writing her Wuhan diary, that since she was locked down at home with the 11 million Wuhan people, she became the target of the state. And any information about government credibility, about their false number, Wuhan's real death toll, any information about origin of the virus, any information about something different from the Chinese government official narratives, again being suppressed, and people who speaking out are being arrested or silenced. And I'll give you one more example for ordinary Wuhan mother, Yang Min, who lost her 24-year-old daughter. And she herself is a survivor of the coronavirus. On May 11th, she held a sign, read that the government concealed the truth of the epidemic. Give me back my daughter. And on the other side of the sign, it says, injustice. She was violently being driven away by the police. And we haven't seen her ever since. I will simply stop here to take more questions before there's many other issues we can address about truth, pandemic, and the behavior of Chinese government.
Thank you very much, Xiao, for these very important remarks. I'm going to move. We'll come back to you in a few minutes after we hear from Sarah and Chris. I'm going to move to Sarah now with the second question. Sarah, what are some of the key trends observed during the past few years regarding censorship of the media, journalism, and the internet in China? How has the pandemic compounded this censorship? And how has China emerged as the world's leading jailer of journalists? Sarah.
Thank you, Judith. So I'm going to take a step back to answer Judith's question, and then from what Xiao said, and then come back to the pandemic. And so I think what we see is that, as many of you know, China has long been home to one of the world's most restrictive media and internet landscapes. And in fact, it is home to the most sophisticated and multi-layered apparatus of censorship and surveillance in the world. But as Xiao was saying, over the past 5 to 10 years, particularly under Xi Jinping's leadership, it's become even more restrictive. And so I think there's 3 trends that we've seen that are relevant and really tie into the conversation about the pandemic. The first is we've seen tightened, expanded, and more automated internet censorship in China. So Freedom House, every year we do an annual assessment of internet freedom in 65 countries around the world. It's called Freedom on the Net. And last year, China emerged as the worst abuser of internet freedom for the 4th year in a row. But perhaps even more interesting is China's score today relative to when we started the project 10 years ago. And there's been a notable decline. So it's not just that China is one of the most restrictive places for the internet anywhere in the world where people actually have access, say not North Korea, but even relative to the amount of freedom and communication and anonymity that Chinese people were able to have 10 years ago, the space has shrunk considerably over the last decade. And one of the ways that's manifested and had already begun in 2018 and 2019 is that the scale of content removals and website closures and social media account deletions was expanding. And so what used to be that if you wrote something that the Chinese government didn't like, or the social media company was afraid would get them in trouble, the comment would be deleted. And that still happens en masse. But increasingly, we're seeing that people's actual full accounts are being deleted. And particularly on WeChat, which is this social media platform that kind of combines Facebook and ePay and all kinds of different functions and is really essential to people's day-to-day life in China today, we're seeing more and more people having their whole account be shut down. We're also seeing more deletion and restrictions on apolitical topics and platforms, entertainment, dating, celebrity gossip, and increasingly the Chinese applications are able to automate censorship more and expand and the sophistication and breadth of the censorship by using artificial intelligence. So I think that's one of the things that we were seeing before the pandemic. One of the other things is that the topics of censorship and what is considered sensitive information has also expanded. So I think a lot of people will think of, Tiananmen Square, Tibet, Falun Gong, Uyghurs, any kind of democracy movement, exposure of human rights abuses. But when we look at, and Freedom House has analyzed a lot of the censorship directives that actually Xiao's team at China Digital Times obtains and publishes and translates, we've done content analysis. And one of the top topics of breaking news that is regularly censored is information about public health and safety. So I think that's where you see what happened with regards to the pandemic has not been an anomaly. It was something that was perhaps going to happen at one point or another, simply because of the systematic censorship and restrictions that surround even topics of public health and safety in China. I think the other thing, the second trend I would say, is that the authorities are increasingly resorting to legal reprisals. So again, it's not just that your comment will be censored, but people are basically being detained and jailed. And Judith mentioned that China is the world's largest leading jailer of journalists. And we do see cases, even fairly recently, there was a professional journalist who was sentenced to 15 years in prison for exposing corruption. But actually, when you look at it, professional journalists still comprise a fairly small proportion of Chinese citizens who are detained or imprisoned for sharing information what's happening in the country. And it's largely because of the institutionalized censorship of the media that doesn't actually usually allow their reports to even make it to print. And so when you look at lists of jailed journalists, you see a lot of citizen journalists, a lot of bloggers, a lot of activists, a lot of members of ethnic minorities like Uyghurs and Tibetans. But even those lists are still a drop in the bucket in terms of the number of ordinary Chinese citizens that get detained for online offenses. And you see that in reports from grassroots websites and human rights groups, from court verdicts that we've looked at. And so one of the things that we've seen is that in this space too, the various categories of Chinese citizens that risk being detained or obtaining legal reprisals for accessing or sharing information online has also expanded in recent years. And so we've seen more people who use Twitter being called in by police. We've seen people who get detained and even sentenced to prison, either for using or often for sharing various tools that allow people to jump the Great Firewall. Various activists who operate civil society or human rights related websites being sentenced to very long prison terms. And all of these activities just a few years ago were really considered to be on the safe side of the red lines. And so that's, again, one of the reasons why you see somebody like Li Wenliang and some of the doctors in Wuhan basically thinking that, you know, there's this vibes, and I'm going to share something on a relatively private chat group with my colleagues saying that we have this emerging SARS-like virus in our city and you want to take precautions. And so they don't even expect that they're going to face some kind of legal reprisal, but then they do. And in his case, it was a reprimand and he was forced to retract and sign this kind of very communist, I would say, you know, kind of confession. But we see a lot of cases of ordinary WeChat users being sentenced to prison and facing prosecution. And I'll give you a few examples from 2019. I think it gives a good sense for the scope and of how common actually this is becoming in China for people whose names we might not see, you know, headlines say in a New York Times article, or that many of us might not have heard of. So we saw, for example, a fellow who wasn't even just writing on WeChat, but was just moderating a popular WeChat account that shared news from outside China for people inside the firewall. And he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. A professor from Guangdong province was jailed for 3.5 years for posting images related to the people who practice Falun Gong and the persecution they face in China. A 22-year-old Tibetan monk was arrested for expressing concerns about Beijing's policies related to Tibetan language. And for Uyghurs in Xinjiang, we don't even know accurate numbers for how many people have been detained and sentenced for simply for using social media. But one case that we do know about was a 24-year-old soccer player who was sent to a re-education camp because he'd used WeChat to contact family members who had fled the country. So I think that just gives a little bit of context again to how often it actually happens in China that ordinary users, especially of WeChat, face legal repercussions. And then the third trend I want to talk about, which kind of brings us back to more of the profession of journalism, is the decline in investigative journalism. And so you see a situation where Chinese journalists have long operated in an extremely restrictive media environment. But even in that, and often reported very courageously about all kinds of scandals, tainted vaccines, tainted milk, all kinds of incidents, bullet train crashes. But we have seen that the space and the conditions for investigative journalism have shrunk since 2013. And in fact, that the actual number of investigative journalists has declined. So there was one study by some Chinese academics that found that between 2011 and 2017, the number of investigative journalists in China decreased by almost by half. And even since then, we've seen some of the real leading investigative journalists in China, whole teams that were just disbanded. And a lot of those teams were at these commercially oriented news outlets. So not the main state-run media that we often think of, the People's Daily or China Central Television, but smaller commercially oriented outlets that are still partially state-owned, but are a bit more autonomous. But they've also, number of them have been shut down. Their investigative journalism teams have been gutted. And even the ones that, when they do get an article out, there are all kinds of new controls that are in place to say, stop internet portals from reposting them. And that was one kind of a ban that happened, for example, to Caixin. And so those are three of the trends that we've seen, I would say, emerging and evolving over the last few years, particularly in 2019. When we look at what happened during the pandemic and kind of bringing it back to the present, there are 3 points that I would raise. One, as Xiao was mentioning, we saw a lot of examples of Chinese police working very hard to muzzle independent source of information, particularly at the height of the outbreak in Wuhan. And Xiao mentioned 3 of the very courageous citizen journalists who had been able to film from within the city, who were detained. And as far as we know, 1 has gone home, but 2, I think, are still, we haven't heard from them. But those are actually just the tip of the iceberg. One NGO, Chinese Human Rights Defenders, has documented almost 900 cases of Chinese internet users who were detained through, I think it was till early April, for, quote, spreading rumors. But from the cases whose details we know and we've looked at, it's very clear that many of them were actually reporting firsthand observations of what was happening in their lives or in their community, especially in Wuhan, or criticizing the Chinese government's response, rather than, say, maliciously spreading some kind of disinformation regarding the pandemic. And similarly, the Falun Dafa Information Center is also reporting an uptick of arrests of Falun Gong practitioners throughout China, also numbering in the hundreds, including many who were trying to share uncensored news about the pandemic or tools for how to jump the firewall. I think the second thing we've seen is that social media platforms like WeChat have cracked down on a large number of personal accounts of people who were sharing even innocuous or factual, in some cases like state-approved content, and people had their accounts shut down in the middle of a pandemic. People are in lockdown, they can't reach their families, they're having to order all of their food online and take out and things like that, and their link to the outside world is just shut down, just like that. And there's really like no appeals process, it just happens all of a sudden and that's it. And that we saw lots of reports of that happening. And the third thing, which I kind of always like to try to end on an optimistic note, actually relates to the commercial media and investigative journalists. And it was really inspiring to see how many risks they were willing to take to cover what was happening in Wuhan. We used to see these outbursts happen more often. They become rarer, and so it really stood out. But several commercialized and financial news outlets in China really tried to outpace censors or even directly defy them. And in fact, a lot of what we know about the early cover-up is thanks to reporting by journalists inside China. A lot of those articles were then, of course, censored inside China. But then that's when you kind of see this broader array of ways in which information circulates despite the censors. Archives outside the Great Firewall, all kinds of creative ways, coding, emojis, Korean, Google Translate, all kinds of ways in which these articles were shared within the firewall. And then a whole array of outlets, Chinese language outlets, outside of China, in Hong Kong and Taiwan, the diaspora, Radio Free Asia, even say the New York Times Chinese language website, picking up on these stories and information. And all of that actually reaching back in various ways to people inside China. So I think I would just end on that one of the things that we see is that censorship and controls over the media have tightened under Xi Jinping in ways that would have previously maybe been unimaginable to a lot of us who were following, who have been following China for some time. But important information does still break through.
Thank you very much for these extremely insightful remarks, Sarah. And we'll come back to you in a few minutes as well. I'm going to move to the third question, which is for Chris Walker. So Chris, can you speak about the CCP's international censorship ambitions and how it seeks to defend and also advance its position by suppressing voices beyond China's borders, as well as the implications of this censorship for democratic systems and the democratic idea? Chris.
So thank you so much for the question, Judith. I'd first like to just take this chance, since they're here with me, to recognize my co-panelists, Xiao Chang and Sarah Cook, who I respect so much and who've done such critically important work over the years to help audiences understand China and the way that country's authorities tries to impact democracy around the world. They're really among the foremost minds on these issues, and it's a privilege for me to be on this panel with them today. And so I'm going to touch briefly on 3 points, which will actually build upon much of what Sarah and Xiao have alluded to. And I'd start with the first point, which is that the authorities in China, as we've heard, make a priority of controlling information and ensuring alternative points of view are sidelined within China. And the crackdown to this end has intensified over the last years. This is, I would note, part of a broader pattern that's visible in many parts of the world, and especially so in other repressive settings, including in places like Russia and Iran. But I think what's important to recognize is that as regimes like the one in China has become more active internationally, it's actually had an impact on the integrity of information systems and freedom of the media internationally, including within democratic societies. And I think one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, why would a regime that works with such purpose at home to manage and suppress free expression do otherwise beyond its borders? And I think what we're seeing is that to the extent circumstances permit, the Chinese authorities and those working with them try to put off limits, issues that they themselves feel are out of bounds, even within democratic societies. And I'd note it was 4 years ago this month that this sort of issue was brought into focus when it was a visit, I believe, to Ottawa by China's foreign minister, and a Canadian reporter sought to ask a question and was scolded by the Chinese foreign minister at the time. And I think it brought into relief the mindset that the Chinese authorities bring to these sorts of issues. And if anything, since that time, we've seen even more of this sort of effort to curb speech beyond China's borders on issues that the Chinese authorities feel are out of bounds. And so within Canada, to use this example, there have been concerns raised about the Chinese government's impact on the expression of Chinese Canadians. And this, I think, is part of a pattern we've seen in any number of countries, one that's quite disturbing. I think as we think about how to address these issues, my colleagues and I at the International Forum for Democratic Studies have been working on a series of papers looking at different aspects of the challenge that's emerged to free speech, both in the university setting, in the media setting, and elsewhere. And we've had some really terrific analysts take a close look at this, including Edward Lucas, who's looked at the issue in the context of the journalistic and media realm. Martin Halle has looked at the ways in which investment from China has non-economic costs and can repurpose democratic institutions for non-democratic ends. And the most recent paper we've released is authored by Glenn Tiffert of the Hoover Institution, who looked at how intellectual inquiry is being curbed by the CCP in a whole host of settings, many of which are in open societies. And I think, if anything, the pandemic is going to deepen the vulnerabilities that these institutions face, either because it'll be more difficult to raise money philanthropically in the university context, or the economic situation will become more fraught for independent news media, which has been the case for years and years around the world in so many settings. And it's worth noting that as independent media has been stretched around the world, Chinese state investments in media, both through the outlets that Sarah alluded to, such as Xinhua and CGTN, but through a range of other media outlets and instruments, has grown considerably. And in so many settings now, there is a far more significant presence of Chinese state or Chinese state-aligned media than there was certainly a decade ago. And this is happening concurrently with the stress that's being placed on independent media, including in fragile democracies. And one of the things that the reports we've released earlier this year has found is that we really need to think hard about how to strengthen the resilience of independent media generally, but also in the context of settings where Chinese state media is making inroads as a way to both shape public discussion in these settings, but also to exclude from the discussion issues that the Chinese authorities deem to be off limits. And finally, let me just say a word about the issue of technology. It's really not possible to discuss the challenge we face in the globalization era and in the era of the globalization of censorship without taking into account the increasing importance of technology and how people understand the world around them, how opinions are formed, and how we communicate with each other. I think as we proceed through the pandemic, we're seeing we're really being stretched. On the one hand, we're relying on technology more than ever. At the same time, we haven't really built the norms around the technology that can ensure we can stimulate a race to the top when it comes to free expression, the transparency of information, and the integrity of it, rather than a race to the bottom, which will privilege the manipulation of information, opacity, and censorship and surveillance. And I think this is something that really needs to be prioritized. On this count, I'd commend our audience to really a first-rate article that Xiao Chang wrote in the January 2019 issue of the Journal of Democracy, looking at these issues. I think just coming back to conclude to a point that Sarah made with respect to the rapid advances that China has made in the use of technology for domestic purposes. And I'd really stress the point that the innovations that are being incubated at the domestic level in China in an era of globalization are now being migrated beyond China's borders, such that the platforms, the tools, the systems that many countries are adopting in a wide variety of settings, ranging from authoritarian countries around the world, but also to democracies as far afield as Latin America, to Sub-Saharan Africa, to Southeastern Europe, and elsewhere, are now starting to adopt technologies that may not have the sort of standards and norms wrapped around them that are likely to enrich and enhance democratic accountability. On the contrary, and I think to the extent that China's authorities have gained a running start, in part because of some assumptions that we all had about the extent of the benefits of integration and the mutual benefits of integration have to be rethought so that this is not simply unconditional engagement in these spheres where human rights and democratic accountability are central, but instead that we have principled engagement on these counts that ensure democratic and human rights values are put front and center. And I just conclude by saying that given the stakes involved for all of us, it's really imperative that we strengthen our resilience in the face of an advancing authoritarian tide. It's led by China and the censorship and control that comes along with it. And with that, I'm happy to turn to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Chris. What I'm going to do quickly is I'm going to revert back to Xiao with one quick question, and then back to you and Sarah with our final question, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to run right back to Xiao, and I want to ask you the following question, if you can answer this, Xiao. Canada can impose Magnitsky sanctions against specific Chinese officials who mistreated or silenced whistleblowers, including medical doctors and journalists, in the early days of the pandemic. How can these sanctions prove to be effective in holding the CCP to account?
Well, thank you for the question. That's come back to the accountability. Because the pandemic is beyond of the borders, causing damage to other nations and all over the world. So the accountability should also count in that it can come from the other countries. But let me share this with you, that in China, the Chinese government has been quite successfully galvanizing the extreme nationalism to support its legitimacy, particularly when they're facing foreign governments' criticism, pressures, or sanctions. The domestic and nationalistic sentiments will usually get very strong. But when you come to sanction to specific Chinese government officials with a specific crime or that being accountable on human rights violations, such as Xinjiang, such as or other human rights violations. Now we're talking about silencing the whistleblowers and others. The Chinese public show unusual support to such sanction. The Chinese popular opinion usually can be easily overwhelmed by the extreme nationalism when the issues like sanctioning specific Chinese government officials on specific clear human rights violations. Usually it becomes silent, those nationalist voices. People can see those are bad things done by bad people. It is right to hold them accountable, whether within China or outside of China borders.
Thank you very much, Xiao. I'm going to move now quickly to Sarah and Chris before I open it up to some questions from the audience. Sarah, we'll start with you, and it'll be a question for you, Chris. I'm very interested in hearing both of your interventions. As you may know, Canada co-sponsored the first ever global conference on media freedom and will be hosting the second conference in September 2020. What initiatives can Canada take with other democracies to safeguard the integrity of journalism beyond China's borders?
So there are a few things. So in addition to all the various things I talked about happening inside China, in January, Freedom House published a report that I'd written about Beijing's global megaphone and the way in which the Chinese government and the Communist parties, as Chris alluded to, really the propaganda, the disinformation, the censorship efforts, and control over content delivery systems and social media platforms is increasingly expanding outside of China. And over the last decade, it's expanded, and over the last few years, it's accelerated even further. And so at the end of that report, we have some recommendations, and I'll say three that I think really stand out. I think the first one, and this goes to this question of accountability, is to really hold Chinese diplomats to account, because they're increasingly aggressive. They engage in all kinds of much worse intimidation, actually, than what Chris had alluded to that Wang Yi had done during a public press conference, in terms of, especially within Chinese communities outside of China, but not only, intimidating advertisers of this in Chinese media, intimidating journalists, and now I think increasingly also spreading disinformation on social media platforms. So I think really calling them out, and even, and we've had a few examples of this happening in the last few years, is very important. I think the other thing relates to the social media platforms, because a lot of the examples of censorship I was talking about were happening on WeChat inside China. But increasingly, we're seeing evidence, certainly of surveillance. There was a big report identifying that, of WeChat users outside of China, but also accounts of censorship. And WeChat is now being used by 100, maybe even 200 million people outside of China. Many members of the Chinese diaspora, but not only. In a lot of countries in Southeast Asia and in South Asia, people are using it. And that just opens a huge door to all kinds of manipulations, electoral manipulation. And so I think really making sure that these companies like Tencent that owns WeChat, or like ByteDance that owns TikTok, are really closely scrutinized in terms of the data privacy and also censorship and moderation is very important, so that we're holding them to the standards in democratic societies, as opposed to letting the Chinese Communist Party bring its repression and censorship overseas. And I think the last thing is really trying to find ways to support Chinese language media that are not aligned with Beijing, and trying to find ways to support journalists, to support the media. There are all kinds of different examples, but they really face an uphill battle. And I think a lot of the media, also in Hong Kong, now with the national security law, are going to be facing an even tighter environment. And a lot of them are really an important source of information also for people inside China. So I think those would be three things that we're looking at the global expansion of China and Chinese Communist Party media controls. Those are three things that the countries like Canada, but not only, but other democracies can take.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Chris?
So I think, first of all, it's important to recognize the initiative that the Canadian government is taking to organize this global media forum. It's so critically important on so many levels. I think as it relates to China's engagement in the media and information space globally, it's terribly important to put into context just how massive the scale and scope of the engagement is. I think there's been an underestimation of this. Sarah alluded to WeChat now having 1 billion users overall, tens of millions of which are using the platform beyond China's borders. And the report issued last month by Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, among other things, identified the ways in which the monitoring of content on WeChat of users outside of China was being fed into purposes for refining censorship within China. And that's just one example of how this is working. And so I think there are some extraordinarily important systemic technological related issues for which we need a better understanding. There's also an effort that happens broadly speaking, and Sarah knows this so well, and she's done great work on it, on how the Chinese state engagement globally seeks, on the one hand, to amplify a very narrow set of views that are consistent with that authoritarian government's point of view, while at the same time working assiduously to sideline views wherever possible that are challenging the government in Beijing. And this can be either in the form of sidelining news outlets on the one hand, or independent voices. And you can imagine in this day and age where journalists and news organizations are under such extraordinary duress in financial terms, which will become undoubtedly more acute in the COVID and post-COVID environment, that the stress though that all of these institutions will feel to get the word out and properly cover these issues will be all the more acute. And I think what any number of organizations have done recently, which is terribly important, including Freedom House, I'd note, is to start explaining in greater detail the ways in which local media institutions are using news content coming from Chinese state media sources. And this also has an economic basis. So for a news outlet in a country whose economy and news media is struggling, when they have an opportunity to use and adopt content coming, say, from Xinhua at either no cost or low cost compared to news wires like Reuters, for example, it's often the case that they will go with the less expensive alternative. But I think it's important to recognize that in such cases, less expensive does not mean less costly. And I think this is also something that we've underestimated in recent years.
Thanks so much, Chris. We have quite a few questions that have come in from the audience. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first one out and I'm going to allocate it to, I think this one should be for Xiao. So the first question reads as follows. What non-Chinese pro-China disinformation efforts have you seen regarding COVID, either from individuals, organizations, or states?
Well, all of them above. Right? Let's start from the states. Yeah, it's starting from the spokesperson of Foreign Ministry Affairs of People's Republic of China, Zhao Zhijian, on his own tweet account, started to share the unreliable information about the coronavirus was brought to China by American military personnel without presenting any evidence. That is from a state foreign ministry's spokesperson. If it's non-official or state media personnel like Global Times or Xinhua, but then there are individuals and in disguise, technology trolls that on Twitter. Actually, today there's an article on English media that about New York Times on the Chinese government behind thousands of Twitter accounts, that fake Twitter accounts, that when the one Twitter account tweeted something like China made a great victory on the fighting for coronavirus, and then there's thousands of Twitter accounts retweeting them as a microphone and the propaganda effort outside of China. But let's talk about another issue which Sarah already touched upon, which is surveillance technology. The Chinese government is promoting now a new message, which is a centralized top-down mobilization control system like China is now has an advantage to combating the coronavirus. Well, that does have some truth to it. But is this advantage, what kind of cost of Chinese people are paying? The surveillance technology now being used from drones to cell phone apps, particularly this thing called health code, which on practically every Chinese citizen's cell phone right now, that collected your personal, not only health information, geolocation, social networking information, and who knows what else, and can decide where you can go what kind of transportation access you could have or not having, and whether you can go to a job or not. For controlling the pandemic, this is actually currently a very effective tool for for the contact tracing, etc. But the Chinese government now, many local governments, starting from Suzhou, Hangzhou, already started to announce that they are going to use this health code and health app for other government social services. In other words, they want this app stay on people's phone after the pandemic control, the usage beyond the pandemic control. And that is extremely worrisome because the Chinese citizens' privacy and personal information is already in government hands. But if they are all on their app, in their cell phone on every day, that is a terrifying situation.
Thank you very much, Xiao. We're starting to run a bit out of time, but I think we have maybe a few more minutes for one or two more questions. So this question is for Sarah. What can people in the West do to protect Chinese journalists, stand up for the rights of jailed journalists?
Well, I think there's a few things. One, just sharing their stories makes a difference. So making sure that people, when you come across the information, other people know about it. Certainly writing to your elected officials and asking them. I would say not only to write to officials in China, but to bring it up with the embassy, for example. And actually, and I know I'm working at Freedom House, but I used to be very active in Amnesty International. But I think, signing up for Amnesty's alerts and writing letters. And I've interviewed people, they weren't journalists always, they were other political and religious prisoners from China. And, when the letters came in, they didn't always know that that was the case, but they noticed a change in the way they were being treated. And in fact, one fellow was saying that when they were doing forced labor in the labor camp, he asked for some kind of mask to protect him. And instead of the guards saying, like, what are you talking about? Get out of here. They actually gave masks to everybody in the room. And, and only later he realized that it was because a bunch of people, I think it was especially from a small town in Sweden, were writing letters for him. And so I think one of the things we see right now in China is that the Chinese government is becoming more immune to international pressure. And so unfortunately, that kind of pressure doesn't result in people actually who are wrongfully jailed actually getting released. But it can result in shorter prison terms, in medical parole, or at least in protecting them from torture and abuse in custody, which is so rampant in China. So I would say that's one thing. The other thing I would say is look at your investments, because so many international retirement funds right now are invested in companies like Tencent, for example. And WeChat is just such a surveillance and increasingly arrest tool for the Chinese government for professional journalists, but also, as you saw, for all kinds of ordinary citizens. So I would say those are two things that people might want to consider.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And so we'll move to our last question because we are running out of time. And this one is for Chris. Chris, what are some policy options against China? Should collective recognition of Taiwan's independence or the inclusion of Japan, South Korea, and even India into NATO be considered?
So I think the way that I would address that question, not engaging in a policy debate, which Ned does not do. But I think I would take the spirit of that question and answer it in the following way, which is to say the paramount value we should look for now is unity. I think what we're seeing in so many settings, starting with some of the strongest performing, most mature democracies on the globe, countries like Sweden, Denmark, countries in other parts of Europe, are facing enormous challenges that their societies are grappling with. Australia was among the first countries to really start to engage and have a meaningful public discussion about ways to respond to the corrosive aspects of the Chinese party state's engagement in that country and responding in a way that stayed true to liberal democratic values. I think the debates that happen in places like Australia and elsewhere show that this is really difficult business and you can't skirt it. What you need are both journalists and civil society putting these issues into the public domain so that ordinary citizens and policymakers have a clear understanding and put them into context, and then have society settle on the sorts of responses that can ensure the integrity of democratic institutions, including free expression, which has really been at the epicenter of this debate. When you boil everything away, it's been central to what's happening in universities. It's been central to what's been happening in the media sector. In so many instances, it's been central to public policy and political discussions in the countries I mentioned and others. There's really no country that's escaping this. I think the other thing we have to bear in mind is that to the extent the more mature democracies are unable to settle on the norms and standards for the sort of full spectrum response that's required to properly defend democracy, it's going to be incredibly difficult for countries whose institutional roots are not as strong. And right now, I think what we need to recognize is that we're really all in this together, and we need to try to find ways both within our own countries to support each other and our institutions, and then beyond that, to make sure that democratic states are supporting each other. And that's true within North America and farther afield. And so I think we should really emphasize this aspect of it, even under these difficult circumstances.
Wonderful. So, folks, we're out of time. I just want to say very quickly that I'd like to thank our distinguished group of panelists for their very insightful remarks and their expertise. This has been extremely interesting. And I will now move you to panel 2, which will be moderated by Kyle Matthews on China's political prisoners and mistreatment of minorities. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Oh,
Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. It says we're on panel 1 Q&A, but we're actually now on panel 2, that we're going to talk about 2 very important human rights issues in China. That's China's political prisoners and its mistreatment of minorities. Today, we're going to start off. We have 3 amazing speakers with profound experience, with a lot to share with us from individual perspectives. The first is Nuri Turkel. Nuri is a commissioner of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's also the founder of the Uyghur Human Rights Project. He will be followed by Naomi Kikoler. Naomi is a director of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And she will be followed later by Sheng Zui, an award-winning poet, journalist, writer, and human rights activist, who is also currently the vice chairperson of the Federation for a Democratic China. The issues we're talking about today are not theoretical, they are real, they're in the media. If anyone looked today, for example, Deutsche Welle, the German public broadcaster, had a detailed expose on Uyghurs in Xinjiang, China, being forced to pick a crime off a balance sheet and then just thrown in jail with no time in front of a court or whatever. This is a serious issue that's ongoing. And we also have political prisoners who are speaking up, either citizen journalists or medical doctors or democracy activists. So we aim to have an extremely interesting discussion. Before we start, I would just like to make the statement that my institute has been working on these issues for a few years now. Last year, we hosted Dolkan Issa, the leader of the World Uyghur Congress, and we had the Chinese Consul General to Montreal try to shut down our event. He put pressure on the mayor of Montreal to shut down a university-based event. So tying to the issues of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, as Chris mentioned in the first panel, there are cases where universities are coming under enormous pressure and we must push back. So first, each of our speakers have been invited to give a 5 to 7 minute presentation. We will then follow with a discussion among all the panelists, and then we'll turn to the audience on social media for detailed questions. So I'd like to ask Nuri, the floor is all yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Kyle, for that introduction. I wanted to thank the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights for inviting the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for USERF to participate in this important event. It is truly an honor to join you all, especially in my new capacity as a USERF Commissioner. For many of us who work on human rights promotion as government officials, Raoul Wallenberg is something of patron saint. As I'm sure many of you know, Wallenberg served as a Swedish diplomat in Budapest during World War II, when Hungary was occupied by the Nazis. Rather than standing by, he used his authority to issue protective passports to European Jews. He also sheltered Jews in the buildings designated as Swedish territory. Historians estimated that he saved tens of thousands of men and women and children from what later come to known as the Holocaust. Unfortunately, Wallenberg himself disappeared after the Soviet occupation of Budapest. However, his legacy lives on. The Representative Tom Lantos, a longtime champion of human rights in the US Congress, was one of those young Jews saved by Wallenberg. Lantos played an important role in creating USERF through the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. He was an important partner in our work before his unfortunate passing in 2008. So in a sense, USERF might not exist, but for Raoul Wallenberg's bravery. USERF was created to address exactly the type of religious freedom abuses that Wallenberg challenged and that Representative Lantos endured. We are an independent government commission created by Congress in order to elevate and promote religious freedom around the world. We do this by monitoring and reporting on religious freedom conditions in dozens of countries, including China, and by making policy recommendations to the White House, State Department, and Congress. Our commission has been warning about religious freedom violations in China from the very beginning. In our very first annual report, published in 1999, we condemned the Chinese government's crackdown on independent religious groups. Even at that time, USERF warned the US government not to ignore human rights and freedom of religion in China. As the earlier panel have noted, the situation has only worsened, gotten worse since then. Millions of Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, an Orwellian surveillance state has been built and managed. Organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners are still in practice. Nighttime rape against house churches is still being practiced by the Chinese government. Expelling thousands of Tibetan monks and nuns from their monasteries are still happening as we speak. The scale of China's repression would be unfathomable if I did not know so many people personally affected by it. Sometimes while reading about these developments, I find myself wondering if there are any Wallenbergs in China quietly working to mitigate the repression. I'm sure many of you saw the report by the New York Times last November about the leaked Chinese government documents from the Uyghur region. The report described the chilling details how Chinese government created the largest concentration camp network in the world since World War II. That report was only possible because the Chinese government official leaked more than 400 pages of official documents to journalists. This unnamed official risked his or her life and liberty in order to ensure that Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders would not escape responsibility for their crimes. The leaked documents discuss another Chinese official, Wang Yongzhi, a former Chinese Communist Party boss of Yerkang County as part of the Kashgar Prefecture. Mr. Wang initially went along with the government's crackdown of Uyghurs. At some point, however, he had a change of heart and released 7,000 internees from the camps in his jurisdiction. Mr. Wang warned his superior that the government's ruthless assault on Uyghur Muslims did not reflect the realities on the ground. He also reportedly told the party officials that there was nothing wrong with having Quran at home. He even encouraged them to read it in order to better understand the Uyghur culture. Rather than heed his advice, Chinese government, Communist Party, stripped him of power and persecuted him. Nor is Mr. Wang alone. The Times reported that thousands of government officials in Xinjiang were punished for resisting or failing to carry out the crackdown, quote unquote, sufficient zeal. What can the United States do to encourage any remaining Raoul Wallenberg or Wang Yunzhi in the Uyghur region to act on the better angel of their nature? One approach would be to impose financial sanction and visa bans under the Global Magnitsky Act against those Chinese officials responsible for the mass internment of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in the region. Fortunately, the Uyghur Human Rights Act, which Congress passed last month, directs the administration to do just that. I urge President Trump, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, to put two names on top of that list. First, Chen Quanguo, the current Communist Party Secretary in Xinjiang and former Secretary of Tibet. The second, Zhu Hailun, the former Xinjiang Political and Legal Affairs Commission chief, who happened to be the key architect of the concentration camp system. Doing so will send a message to the anonymous leakers and other Wang Yunzhis in the Chinese bureaucratic system, who would be willing to risk their lives and who will not be doing so in vain. The world will hold these responsible for those crimes accountable. In addition, it's incredibly important that we try to document the actions of lower level Chinese officials. We need to keep track of those who committed abuses and who resist. The State Department's Office of Global Justice, Criminal Justice, and the Holocaust Memorial Museum are well positioned to act as research hubs for this effort. Perhaps one day this information will be used in trials to hold those responsible for these crimes against humanity accountable. History will remember who stayed in silent, who took a stand against the Communist Party's war on faith. We have to make concrete progress during the past few years, but that is not enough. It will take many more years of long, hard work to see justice for the Uyghur people, Tibetan Buddhists, Christians, and Falun Gong practitioners in China. As we do so, we should never forget the example of Raoul Wallenberg, who provided that one person can make a difference. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Nuri. That was a powerful presentation, and I'm glad you mentioned Wallenberg. Talk about the power of individuals to make a difference, and I was really left feeling your comment. Are there any Wallenbergs in China? And I'm sure there are. No doubt there have to be. I would like now to ask Naomi Kohler of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to take the floor.
Thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you for all of the organizers for today's incredibly important conversation. And it's a real honor to be here and to join my fellow panelists in the conversation. As an institution, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum seeks to do for communities today what was not done for Jews during the Holocaust. And in the course of the work that we do, one of the hard lessons that we grapple with is that often the resolve of those who are intent on perpetrating crimes is often far greater than those who seek to stop them. And I think that when we're looking at the reality of mass atrocities that are being committed by the Chinese government, that is very true. And it's one of the really challenging aspects of trying to determine what a course of action is for responding. I think for us, we start from the premise of trying to acknowledge and give voice to the survivors, to Nuri and others who are living the reality and the consequences of what we believe are crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated by the Chinese government against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. And to those who at great risk to themselves and their families are choosing to speak out. And very much appreciate the emphasis that Nuri put on the heroic people within China, within the Chinese government, who recognize that what is happening is not right. Part of the important lessons that we have found from the Holocaust and through the physical space of the museum and our online exhibits, which thankfully you can still access right now, try to share, is that it is so often the individual leadership of key people who are able to help change the course of action, but usually only when in conjunction with allies and partners elsewhere that are working to help put a spotlight and elevating not just the attention, but also changing the incentives for the actors who are perpetrating the crimes. And that's where I think right now a lot of our energy and focus has to be looking at how, in addition to the tools that Nuri mentioned, can we be doing that for the Uyghur community and for others. One of the great challenges we of course face is the access to information. And often that is expressed as something that is inhibits our ability to act. I think we need to interrogate that, and I think the first panel and even Nuri kind of spoke to this, and it's been documented. There is actually a lot of information about what is happening to the Uyghur community and to others. It's remarkable when you think of what is available from those who have left and who've able to share their stories once in exile. It's also remarkable when you look at what the Chinese government itself has said, and when they have explained the rationale for, as Kyle said, the detention of people without cause, where there is references to some form of a justification. It's quite clear that that reinforces a narrative around what we argue could be persecution. I think one of the things that's really important to acknowledge when we talk about this, and maybe just to kind of give the sense of perspective, is that we are looking at the mass detention of a people, not just on the basis of their religion, as Nuri said, but also their ethnic identity. And that when we think even about kind of where MIGS is based in Montreal, you know, if one was to really take a step back and imagine that we're talking about the entirety of the population of Montreal that is either in some form of detention or extreme surveillance. It has been in detention at some stage. That's how stark the challenges and the situation is. Yet, if it was any other country that was committing crimes on this scale, this would be the issue that would be before the Security Council on a regular basis, before the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly. We would be seeing not just every now and then news articles, and I really commend the journalists that have been covering it, but really I believe this would garner far more attention than it has. One of the reasons that we feel it's so important to talk about crimes and to actually invoke the language of crimes against humanity is because we believe that there are corresponding responsibilities, not just for the government of China, but also for the international community to respond, and that those are stemming from the fact that we believe that there is widespread and systematic crimes against humanity that are being committed against this particular community. One of the efforts that we're trying to undertake is to continue to advance that legal analysis and make that available, as Nuri said, to help form the basis for future engagement by not just the Uyghur and Turkic community, but also from the broader international community. We know that perpetrators often use and try to find some sort of rationale for their crimes. Another aspect of our work is trying to examine and interrogate some of those rationales, including this notion of fighting terrorism, eradicating poverty, and recognizing that those are not by any means any form of justification for the scale and nature of the crimes that have been occurring, of the mass detention, forced labor, discriminatory laws, high-tech manners of surveillance that are reinforcing those violations of rights. One of the things, maybe just kind of in leaving to reinforce the point that Nuri made around accountability and our hope and belief that there will be a time when those committing these crimes are held responsible. Sometimes there is a misunderstanding around just what exactly crimes against humanity are. Often in our work, there is a perception by some that only genocide are crimes that merit attention from the highest of possible courts, be it the International Criminal Court, tribunals that have been stood up. It's really important to recognize that crimes against humanity alongside genocide were very much born out of the Nuremberg process coming out in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And the gravity of those crimes, the seriousness of those crimes are of such import that we don't want to further kind of perpetuate the idea that they are of lesser importance to the crime of genocide. And so our hope is that by also articulating quite clearly the crimes that are being committed, we help to also advance the effort from a legal perspective to hold perpetrators accountable, but also to urge governments to fulfill their obligation to protect vulnerable communities, and to the Chinese government to stop the commission of crimes against humanity. So we look forward to continuing to help to advance this conversation, and also urge the world to treat China in the same way that any other country who was committing crimes on this scale would be treated by the international community, and to recognize that that might touch on incredibly sensitive points for us, including our trade policy. But this is a matter of not just conscience, it's a matter of international policy, it's a matter of the future of how mass atrocity crimes are committed, and our ability as an international community to have our norms and institutions evolve to meet the evolving way in which these crimes will be committed in the future. So thank you for this opportunity, Kyle.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Very detailed analysis, and very interesting to hear the thoughts coming from the Genocide Prevention Center at the U.S. Holocaust Museum on this important case that's before us. I would now like to ask Sheng Zui. I apologize if I didn't pronounce your name properly, Zui, but I'd like to give the floor to you and have you also talk a bit about the political prisoner element of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my pleasure to talk about this, especially in this kind of timing. 2 days later, it will be the 18 years that Dr. Wang Bingzhang was kidnapped by the Chinese government back to China from Vietnam and sentenced to life and imprisoned in solitary confinement. Dr. Wang Bingzhang came to Canada, studied in McGill University in 1979, and obtained his PhD degree in medical. And he started the Overseas Chinese Democracy movement. In 1982, he was kidnapped by the CCP from Vietnam back to China in 2002 and sentenced to life. His brother, who lives in Mississauga, told me that the family in Canada has not received any information from Dr. Wang since the outbreak last December in China. And yesterday, I received the letter from Wang Li, the letter from Wang Li, who is Wang Zhang's wife. Show you Wang Zhang. This is Wang Zhang's wife, and she asked the international community to rescue his husband. And this is their 4 kids. And she asked because she said that 10 days ago, more than 40 police officers came to her family, and more than 20 policemen guarded the door. And another 20-some police broke into the door and pressed Wang Zhang's head onto the ground. And some police also held down 4 kids and their grandma. The police wrapped Wang Zhang's head into a black bag and handcuffed him and dragged him away in front of the 4 kids. And his wife has no any information from him then. And Wang Zhang is a talented poet and a writer who refused to operate with the tyranny and also write about the truth of the pandemic. People may know that hundreds of Chinese human rights lawyers have been seriously persecuted. Many of them were tortured and given unknown drugs. However, you may don't know what will happen if you help those lawyers. A Chinese medicine Dr. Zhao and his wife fled to Canada from China last October and lives with us now. He helped and treated some of the human rights lawyers. As a result, all of his business licenses were cancelled by the government, and several cameras were
Sheng Zui, I believe we've had you freeze for a second, so we're going to ask you to try to rejoin us.
members. Am I okay now?
We can hear you now. Yes, please continue.
Yeah. So there are also Fang Bin. Can you hear me?
Sheng, you are slight.
Can you hear me?
We're having trouble hearing you. I'm wondering if maybe maybe I can ask a few questions and we'll see if your connection becomes a little bit stronger in a few minutes. Is that okay?
I have backup. You to use my because I am using my iPad and I noticed that some problems, so I can use my cell phone to continue.
So if you want to,
you can see me.
Yeah, well, we can hear you, but it's very choppy. So maybe we'll ask you to We can hear you now. Thank you. You still have 2 more minutes to continue.
Of deaths persecuted by the CCP can no longer be counted. The death number of Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Falun Gong practitioners, Christians, human rights defenders,
citizens who have been demolished their houses, and the farmers who have been robbed their lands, etc., have becoming ICE data. So who can tell the exact number, and who still has the patience to care about their stories and the lives? So when more than 150 Tibetans continued to call for attention from the international community with self-immolations during the past decade, and when the organs of more than 1 million Falun Gong practitioners were stolen their organ alive for 2 decades, when millions of Uyghur Muslims were put in the 21st century's concentration camp, and when thousands of churches and the temple were demolished, and millions of Christians and monks were detained and tortured, and when thousands of young people in Hong Kong were brutally killed one by one in front of the whole world for a whole year, many of them were pressed by the police against their heads and their necks. There has been no large gathering demonstrations initiated by the mainstream society of democratic countries. Am I right? I wish I'm wrong. And 31 years ago, the CCP publicly used tanks and machine guns to kill thousands in Beijing and other.
Sorry, Zui, I think we're having trouble hearing you. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to start asking some questions to get a general discussion going with everyone. And hopefully we can have you connect with us in a second. So I have a general question or a comment, and then I'd like to see who could, Nuri or Naomi, or Zui, if you could answer this question. There has been a lot of interest to have economic ties with China. In Western countries, in Asian countries, they see it as a great place to make money. But at the same time, we're starting to see more stories emerge about companies that are trying to set up shop in China that aren't quite aware that there are atrocities or crimes against humanity taking place there, as well as political prisoners. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what role should civil society actors be doing, as well as media, in trying to raise awareness about the dangers of economic integration with China when there are actual real cases of crimes against humanity taking place?
Should I start?
Yes, please, Nuri.
Initially, when China brought into the global economic system with the help to develop their technology, education system, the world believed that China will be one of us. Obviously, that didn't happen. Instead of using that economic power, diplomatic influence to join join the democratic system or reform their political system, China has been using that very power, very influence for political repression. Not only that, the slavery is brought back by the Chinese authorities as part of the effort to engage in this human engineering that has been described by policy experts, China observers. With that, China effectively polluted the global economic system, supply chain. The United States government has done several significant things since the forced labor issue come to surface, including banning certain products, certain companies, including to add the China's entities to Commerce Department's entity list. So the business as usual cannot continue. It's past time for action. The individuals working for these global companies, especially in the technology sector, need to speak out. They need to take a position, and they need to use their position to pressure those companies, either wittingly or unwittingly aiding the Chinese state to not only build the current the surveillance state and political repression apparatus, but also need to find a way to stop it. At the end of the day, Chinese government pays attention to where their interest lies. One, their global image, the global calling them out for their repressive policies and ghastly human rights abuses is one way to do it. And then the second is that we need to look into their economic interest, as the way that the current administration, the US government, has done with a number of executive decisions that we have been seeing since last year.
Thank you, Nuri. Very fascinating. Would anyone else like to comment on this?
I'll just quickly, jump in, Kyle. I think you raise a really important question. It's 2020. Our ability to understand the interconnectedness of our economic system with countries where gross human rights violations are occurring is incredibly sophisticated at this point. And I really commend the organizations that have been documenting the supply chain issues that pertain to the production of an array of material in Xinjiang. It's humbling when you think that, a large percentage of the world's cotton, a lot of the material that we are wearing every single day is produced in Xinjiang. When you look at the pressure that some of the corporations have come under, Nuri talked about how recent US action has attempted to restrict the ability of some of those entities to both receive assistance but also do business in the US with a greater scrutiny. It's also important to look at the implicit impact that greater scrutiny from civil society, as you noted, and the media has on how large corporations are doing some of their business. Just today, in the last few hours, the Wall Street Journal published an article about the CEO of Volkswagen. And he's been, his role has been changed and somewhat demoted. And they note that one of his perceived leadership failings was that when Volkswagen came under scrutiny for the existence of a production plant in Xinjiang, his answer was that he was not aware of the human rights violations that were happening in Xinjiang, which led to a massive global outcry and considerable additional scrutiny and attention on Volkswagen, and has had some of the impact of forcing other companies to be more transparent about what they're doing in not just Xinjiang, but in China, some to evaluate and pull out and change some of their production behaviors. And it's also had an impact in shaping how some consumers think about how they would like to have their funds used. And in some ways, when we're faced with the reality of a government that is protected in a manner through the Security Council, through its status as a peace treaty, and whereby the economic ties, including through the Belt and Road Initiative, are just so strong and pervasive, which helps to prevent any real sustained and coordinated international action against them. In those spaces, it is what we tend to think of as being kind of track to and other forums where change happens and where it is kind of necessitated. Governments have an important role to play, and I think we've seen some interesting innovation in that in terms of especially looking at dual use technology and research and design that's undertaken in the West and the kind of interplay with China. But I do think this is a moment where we have to be incredibly creative as a kind of international civil society to think about other avenues to increase the pressure on China in a way in which they'll feel it and ideally be compelled to change behavior. Of course, that's one of many strategies that need to be taken, but I would argue, given the uniqueness of China's status and power and how it yields it in a way that silences some of the traditional actors, i.e. states, behavior, we need to really be thinking in a much more creative way about how to engage.
Thank you, Naomi. Zue, let's hope you have a good connection. Would you like to make a comment on the economic connections of Western countries or Asian countries with China and the disregard for human rights concerns? Zue, can you hear me? Would you like to make a comment about this issue?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I need 1 more minute to finish.
Please go ahead.
I don't know if I am attacked because I prepared for 2 equipment, but both are not working well.
It could be possible that someone is trying to, it's possible maybe that some external force is trying to go after your internet access. We don't know, but please, the floor is yours. You can finish your statement.
I don't know what I can do, but since it's okay now, I want to finish. Yeah, China, 1.4 billion people have not become free people, but have more become slaves and weapons of the CCP, and there are such Chinese people all over the world now. And during the pandemic, these people played a big role in lighting the world to the power of CCP. And when CCP copied the outer shell of democracy and stolen our and
Sorry, Zui, we are not able to hear you. I'm not sure if it's a technical issue or something more serious. So I'm going to turn to the other panelists, and hopefully you will be able to rejoin us in a second. So despite those challenges, I would like to ask another question. We were talking about interesting ways to pressure China to stop persecuting the Uyghurs, to stop imprisoning dissidents or those calling for democracy. I saw something quite interesting a few weeks ago. Lawyers for Uyghur Rights, an initiative in London, England, they actually signed an open letter to the Prime Minister providing evidence that Huawei, the giant telecommunications firm, bring surveillance of Uyghur Muslims in China, and was also was lying about its role, and they're trying to get into different Western business companies. I'm wondering if anyone can say anything about that, if that's an issue that we need to explore more or do more research. Would anybody like to comment about that?
I mean, I have to say it's not an issue that we've dealt with squarely and looked at. I think you're speaking to, though, a broader challenge, and this is where that question of what do the future of mass atrocities and the commission of mass atrocities look like, and the tools and technologies that are used to repress populations, and how we often are confronted by entities that are producing and using materials that have kind of dual uses to them, which are hard to then prevent their development of, but also, you know, are being exported and can be used for different reasons by different governments, which I think is just, again, an area that we are beginning to grapple with, and there are really great researchers and also governments committed to exploring this, but it is very much when we think of the creation of the international order and the tools that were established to protect human rights and prevent crimes on the scale of what we're looking at, they're not part of our traditional toolbox, and really does require us to kind of go back to core basics and commit to trying to innovate, because perpetrators are often able to innovate at a much faster pace than we're able to keep up.
Yeah. Thank you, Naomi. I think that's true. We got to look at these new tools among us and look at other ways where we could put pressure. And there are definitely some interesting civil society groups and human rights activists that are out there. I'd like to ask Nuri a question. Nuri, you wrote, just published, I think yesterday or the day before, a pretty interesting essay in I believe it was Time Magazine or Newsweek. Pardon me if I got the media wrong, but you talked about the implication of the Uyghur Human Rights Act, something that just passed by the U.S. Congress. Tell us a bit more about your essay and why this new legislation is so important.
It's a historic turn of events that is happening in the United States. For the first time in Uyghurs' human history, more modern, ancient, a legislative body deliberated and put in place a legislative mandate protecting Uyghurs' political, economic, social interests. And also, this is the first time a legislative body putting in place a legislation or bill to protect their own expat community, such as the Uyghur community here. And this is the first time that an agency, intelligence agency that oversee the intelligence community in the United States is being asked to monitor refugee refoulement and also forced labor issue. So when you look at the substance and historic aspect and personal aspect, this is something that will hopefully will make a difference in Uyghurs' lives, both inside and outside of China. This bill has been in the works for quite a long time. I would say at least a year and a half. And this bill has received bipartisan, bicameral support. 100 senators voted unanimously in favor of this bill. 413 members of Congress voted in favor of this bill. And now it's just waiting for President to sign to make it become a law. Once it's implemented, there's several things will happen. One, the Uyghur issue will become a part of the U.S.-China dialogue. The bill directs the U.S. government to update the Uyghur issue and the U.S.-China relations. And also this law directs the executive branch, the President of the United States, to implement the global Magnitsky sanction on those officials and entities who are responsible for the atrocities being committed against the Uyghur people. And this law also requires the State Department to prepare a report. So when you look at the substance, this will address the most pressing issue, the concentration camp situation, the ongoing cultural genocide against Uyghur people, the mass surveillance, diplomatic and China's misuse and abuse of its diplomatic influence to request governments to refoulement or repatriate refugees. And also, one of the most jarring things happened to the Uyghur people, particularly in this country, is the Chinese government's attempt and efforts to harass, intimidate, in some instance, trying to recruit Uyghurs as their informants to monitor, report the political activities. So I, on a personal level and on my official level, capacity, I'm grateful to the United States Congress for making this happen. And also, at the same time, I urge the Congress to pass the other two bills, particularly the one designed to address the forced labor swiftly. And in the meantime, I urge the president to sign this bill and designate Chinese officials and sanction them under the Global Magnitsky Act as soon as possible.
Thank you. And I think that this this act that's has to go to the president to be approved, I think that's something that other members of parliament, other legislatures across the world should look at. Just as we're seeing the Magnitsky Act be adopted and used by other countries around the world, this act is something as well that other democracies could actually see if it could be useful and replicated. We had one
quick comment, Kyle. The United States is not the only country that has a similar legal tool. Canada has one, UK, other countries in Europe. Not only that has not been implemented, this should give a reason for countries like Australia and others to put in place. This is a very effective tool. We've seen the effect of this mechanism being effectively utilized. There's a precedent that we just need to expand this and become a global norm to go after human rights abusers.
Thank you for bringing it up, Nuri. So I have a few people that have some questions. A few people have said if Sheng Zui, who has had trouble with internet connection, if she had a statement prepared, she can share it with us, and we're willing to put it on our website and to share it on social media so people can read her entire presentation she wanted to make. So we can all follow up with Zui later to get that from her. But another person asked a question earlier saying, what are the main differences and changes between China in 1989 and China today from a human rights perspective? And I'm wondering, Zui, if we can get your connection to work, if you can make a comment, do you think things are worse now, or have they always been the same, or are we seeing it ramping up to be much more, China is much more of a threat to human rights of its own citizens?
Yes, yes. The human rights situation in China is much, much more worse than in 1989. And even though it was not good, but people were not as, I mean, the Chinese environment is more like a jungle. It's worse than a jungle. And everybody need to fight for their chance to live. And the government, of course, is thousands times corrupt, and really they are richer and they are stronger and they have technology, they have everything, but not anything towards democracy and human rights. And of course, this is the responsibility of Chinese people, but also it is the responsibility of the international community. And I strongly urge that we need to come up with the knowledge that the Chinese Communist Party is the biggest terrorist state in our time. And if we want to deal with them, we need to know that who they are, and not to deal with like a normal country, normal government. And that's why Chinese people not only very, very frightened in China, but outside China, like in Canada. So I couldn't have time to share my own story, but I will, ask you if you have the interest, you can search my name online and you will find out how far the Chinese can reach out to seal the dissident and how much power they can use. And especially we learned that now from so many cases, and the Chinese government now they can buy out and to influence so many democratic countries, politicians, and also from even every field, and to drive people to speak for them, to speak on behalf of them. So this is very serious, and it's already very late, and will be too late if we are not realized of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Zui. And we do have had cases, I'm sure in the US, I'm sure in Australia, in Canada, we have had cases of Chinese dissidents being targeted in Canada. We've had the Uyghur Canadians that have been targeted. So it is an enormous challenge for our societies and our democracy. So we have two similar questions coming in. One is more of a comment saying we were able to put a lot of pressure on apartheid South Africa by using boycotts and sanctions and economic sanctions. And there's another person saying that maybe we need to boycott the Winter Olympics that are coming up in China. I'm wondering, does anyone think that, is this realistic? China is so powerful economically. Are countries going to try to do this? Is that a way forward? Anyone want to just jump in and think, is this possible or is it not?
I'd like to make a point. I'd like to address that. When the last Olympic was given to the Chinese, again, I'm just keep referring to the past wishful thinking of how China, what kind of China that the world would like to see. In 2008, the earlier when there was some Bush ended up going to that Olympics, so it didn't work. And the international community in the current environment has upper hand. I would like to think that one, we should try to renegotiate the agreement with previously signed with the Chinese government, that unless they close the concentration camps, at least, that U.S. Athletes will not attend. U.S. government officials will not attend. Our commission has been urging the President Trump to make that publicly, make that statement publicly that U.S. officials will not attend unless the camps are closed. And also, the initial purpose of the Olympic is to promote spirit, unity, friendship. But it would be unthinkable that the athletes from all around the world go to Beijing to compete in the face of all of this political repression, persecution, concentration camp, and those ghastly human rights abuses committed against Uyghur people with a genocidal intent are happening in the background. So you can expect certain governments and entities to do this, certain things your way, but we can start to act what is right on the things that we have a control over. We don't have to go to this sports event unless China's government at least do something to show to the world that they are listening. So that's the least that the international community can do.
Thank you, Nuri. Naomi, did you have something to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really instructive and would be useful to take a look at the 2008 campaign, Dream for Darfur, which was undertaken specifically to try to target the Chinese government around its actions pertaining to Darfur. And there was a very creative and innovative approach that was used to target corporate sponsors to the Olympics, engage individual Olympians, as you mentioned, encourage some of them to consider whether or not they would attend and participate or not, and also find different ways to bring together in a solidarity movement survivors of genocide from around the world to lend their voice. And that was a situation where they were looking at the actions that China was having abroad in support of kind of supplying oil to the government of Sudan and elsewhere. And I think it's an interesting case to examine now, to look at in terms of impact, but also recognize that in some ways the challenge is even greater at this particular point, but it also makes it all that more important to be thinking and evaluating the very question that you raised. I am conscious that, in the midst of the terrors in Argentina during the military dictatorship, there was a kind of commission of inquiry of sorts from the organization American States that went in the midst of the World Cup. And as the members of the commission were touring a particular location, which was a horrific torture site, but had been essentially kind of cleaned up for the purpose of the visit, they could hear in the background, the games that were going on for the World Cup. And that in the aftermath, the survivors of torture recalled those moments whereby the world was focused on Argentina, and Argentina was striving to rehabilitate its image and legitimize its image, while its people were suffering acutely. And I think that we really have to wrestle with what the moral harm will be at this particular moment. I do think it's one that is of such a significant nature that we really do have to interrogate how you can allow for millions of people to face crimes against humanity and endure crimes against humanity as we come together to celebrate something that is supposed to mark a moment where we celebrate humankind and solidarity of people. So I think it's a really important question that you pose, and I think there's some interesting case studies that we can look at to move backwards. I think it's also one of those challenging moments where the question around the difference with Tiananmen Square and today, and even the question of the 2008 campaign and today, you know, obviously China has learned that it should not, although even in the case of Xinjiang this has happened, mow down people in the streets. And again, that has taken place with protests in Xinjiang. And they have reverted to behind closed doors, committing large-scale crimes against humanity. The other things that have changed that would change the effectiveness of some of the strategies that you were suggesting is the efforts that China has made, especially in the last 10 decades, towards its place in the world through becoming an active and important player in UN peacekeeping, increasing its funding to the UN system, putting key officials in key positions within the United Nations, deepening the economic ties that have been discussed at length already in the kind of various conversations. That isolates itself from criticism and raises the cost significantly to some of the actors taking the type of actions that you were talking about, be them state or also non-state actors. So we really have to kind of go in with a pretty clear and sophisticated understanding of what the challenges are and recognize that we might be seeking to advance a number of different goals. I think that those goals each have merit and need to be considered and advanced. I think we also, with some humility, have to recognize that part of the argument that the Chinese government makes, especially around terrorism, feeds off of an international narrative, and a narrative that in many ways has been shaped by Western governments, including the United States, including Canada, around tackling a war on terror and restrictions of civil liberties at home. And, you know, we have to really kind of wrestle with the contradictions then. They're vastly, in some ways, different and in other ways not. So there's an interrelatedness to some of the challenges that are kind of present here. And I think it's really important that you kind of elevated and raised those points and the point from the audience.
Thank you very much. So we're approaching the end of our session. So we're going to have to end it here. There were 3 very important questions. Maybe if those of you would like to, we are having a Twitter chat online. So if anyone after this that can ask that, of course, we don't have time to answer, but people ask questions about why isn't Western media talking more or having more articles about human rights abuses in China. There was another question about how there were some reports that Uyghurs were being forced to work in Western factories as slaves. So why isn't there more pressure on Western companies operating in Xinjiang? And there's been a last question about what can the Muslim world do to stand up for their fellow brothers and sisters of their faith who are in China? So those are 3 questions we don't have time to answer. But I want to thank all of you, Zui, Naomi, Nuri, I want to thank you for joining us, and I'll ask you now to leave the stream. And because we have the other panelists on standby, and I believe Erwin Kotler is the odd man out. He's waiting for us to leave so that he can get into the stream. So thank you very much. And as I repeat, this is going to be broadcast on CPAC, the Canadian Public Affairs channel, at a later date. So you will be able to watch this again if you'd like to.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Am I up? Erwin's not here yet. Well, I don't know if you can hear me, Kyle, but I'm just going to begin.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Is that you, Erwin?
No, that's Carl.
Oh, that's Carl. I meant Kyle.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Okay, so we're up. All right, this panel is going to be focusing on the identification of specific ways to hold the Chinese government accountable for the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic that we're all enduring, and for its human rights abuses as well. And of course, we're including, and I expect we'll be addressing in some detail, Beijing's recent conduct in Hong Kong within that context. The guests that we have with us, the panelists, are Emily Lau Weiking, who is a statesman of the Hong Kong democracy movement, a tremendous journalist and a champion of press freedom. I believe she was the first woman directly elected to LegCo, the Legislative Council of Hong Kong, and that was before the handover. And she represented the New Territories East constituency through the 1990s and until very recently, stepped down in 2016. She was the chair of the Democratic Party of Hong Kong. And last November, she and a young activist, Figo Chan, accepted on behalf of the Hong Kong democracy movement, accepted the John McCain Prize for Leadership in Public Service at the Halifax International Security Forum. We have Erwin Kotler, my lodestar, who is the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. He's an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, Canada's former Justice Minister and Attorney General, longtime MP, well-known international human rights lawyer, leading parliamentarian on the world stage. And I could just spend the rest of the time we have here listing his many accomplishments. One of the things that he's been up to lately, he's the Canadian section or Canadian co-chair of a new initiative, the Parliamentary Alliance on China, which I hope that we're going to be talking about. Kimberly Kitching, Senator Kimberly Kitching, is another panelist and is an Australian co-chair of that Interparliamentary Alliance. She's the Shadow Assistant Minister for Government Accountability and Deputy Manager of Opposition Business in the Australian Senate, leading member of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which I just mentioned, and has been very vocal in criticizing her counterparts in the Victorian Labour Party for their support of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm personally very interested in hearing about. And Carl Gershman, who's the president of the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C., which, if people don't know, which they should, is a tremendous grant-making institution. Its mission is to strengthen democratic institutions around the world through NGOs. Among Carl's many accomplishments, overseeing the grant-making function for the National Endowment for Democracy in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union and Latin America. He was, I think, the founding editor, or he was the founder of the indispensable Journal of Democracy and a number of other initiatives, including an initiative that was launched in New Delhi in 1999, the World Movement for Democracy, which is a global network of democracy activists, practitioners, and scholars. And so why don't we begin in this order, if I may? Ms. Lau, could you begin with us with your opening statements, and then we'll proceed to Erwin and Kimberly, and then to Carl, and then we'll take it open for questions. Ms. Lau.
Okay. Thank you very much, Terry, and a very good morning to you all. Good morning from Hong Kong. And I'm speaking from a very turbulent and very tense city. And yesterday was the first anniversary of the protests against the extradition bill. And hundreds of people, and including young people, turned out to protest, although it was illegal. And I think we are all very, very concerned about the imminent passage of the National Security Act by the National People's Congress Standing Committee which will meet on the 18th of this month. And we see this act, this bill or this law as like driving a truck through the Chinese government, the Communist Party's policy of one country, two systems. Because ever since 1997, when Hong Kong, which was then a British colony, when we were handed over to Chinese rule, for 20 years, things were not too bad. Although we did not have democracy, we enjoyed freedoms, rule of law, personal safety, more than people in some so-called democracies. But since President Xi Jinping came to power at the end of 2012, things started to go wrong because he was quite determined to crack down on his own people in mainland China and also in Hong Kong. And now I think Hong Kong is seen by the international community as in the forefront of this struggle against China, against the Communist Party. And for many years, I think you people probably know better than I do, people in the West thought the way to treat China was engagement, to assist China to rise in the world, to become strong and powerful. But then China will also adopt the behavior of the civilized world, and the people can work together happily, make money, trade, and visit each other. But that, of course, is not the case. And of course, China will not adopt democracy. In fact, President Xi Jinping's gone the other way round. And so we in Hong Kong, we are very, very scared and very alarmed, but many people will not be intimidated. That's why they turned out last night, and they want to turn out in much bigger numbers, but peacefully. Unfortunately, the administration of Carrie Lam, the chief executive, is using the COVID-19 pandemic to say that we have to limit the number of people who can gather publicly to 8. But then they are opening the theme parks. People can go to cinema, to shopping centers. So we say, how come you don't allow people to assemble peacefully? So I want to use this opportunity to tell our friends in the international community that Hong Kong is struggling very hard to keep our freedoms, our personal safety, and the rule of law. Under the national security law, there is one offense about interference from foreign forces and countries. I don't know whether this discussion with my friends in the international community will be allowed after this law is passed by the National People's Congress Standing Committee. But no matter what, we will stand firm. And Hong Kong is an international city. There are hundreds of thousands of people, foreigners living here. 300,000 Canadians, 80,000 Britons, and Americans, French, Japanese, Australians, and so on. So my dear friends, I'm reaching out to you, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this morning, like I spoke to the Canadians when I went to Halifax with Beagle in November, and then I visited Toronto in December. I want to reach out to the international community to tell you that we are not fighting for independence, not secession, not the overthrow of the Communist Party, but we want the Communist Party to keep its promise under the joint declaration, which was signed with Britain in 1984, to keep the promise of the basic law, to allow us to be free, to develop democracy, to be an international city, so that you and all your countrymen and countrywomen can come and visit us, can work and live here. And if Hong Kong is free, like the China human rights lawyers told us, we are a very important city in the People's Republic of China. So please help Hong Kong to stay free, underpinned by the rule of law, independence of the judiciary, and we will continue to work as a very responsible member of the international community. Thank you very much.
Sorry, my mic was muted. Is Erwin Kotler there? Can we turn
I'm
to Erwin?
here.
Very good. It's up. You're up now. There.
Okay, I want to just begin where Emily left off and really commend her for her bravery and her courage. Beijing's proposal to impose national security legislation on Hong Kong in the aftermath of the arrest of 15 pro-democracy activists and legislators constitutes yet another frontal assault on the rule of law, the criminalization of fundamental freedoms protected under Hong Kong's basic law, and politicized prosecutions under the cover of the global pandemic. It reminds us also of another assault on the rules-based international order, the CCP's cover-up of its complicity in the spread of the global pandemic, its suppression of information, its arrests and disappearances of doctors and dissidents, and its global disinformation cover-up campaign. In cover-up, and it is Hong Kong's media that runs the risk of persecution and prosecution under this imposed national security legislation, which is also a breach, and Emily's made reference to this, a breach of the Sino-UK Declaration, which has the status of international treaty. Moreover, an even more egregious extension of the culture of corruption and criminality of Beijing, let alone the impunity which has attended it, into and which has not received the notice and indeed outrage that it warrants, is the state orchestrated incitement against the protesters, against the peaceful protesters, as being themselves a political virus, as being what are referred to as a malignant poison, reminiscent of the state orchestrated incitement against the Uyghurs, who also have been referred to as a malignant virus and infection. Yet another case study of the frontal assault on the rules-based legal order and on the rule of law. Indeed, the assault on the democracy movement in Hong Kong, the assault on the freedom and protection for the Uyghurs are but two of the looking glasses into the existential threats to freedom and democracy in Hong Kong and to safety and security and freedom for the Uyghurs. But it does not end with these two compelling existential threats. We have also, and reference has been made to it in this conference thus far, we have also the repression and displacement of the Tibetans. We have the ongoing persecution and prosecution of the Falun Gong. And we have also the menacing threats to Taiwan. And where Beijing is engaged in an unrelenting assault on media freedom, as described earlier, as well as an assault on the very institutions that are intended to protect the international order. And so the question arises, what is to be done? What is the action that can be taken? Let me summarize, by way of conclusion, a series of initiatives and actions that can be taken. You mentioned, Terry, in your opening remarks, the recent establishment of an inter-parliamentary alliance on China. This involves now parliamentarians from 9 global parliaments who have come together to mobilize a constituency of conscience for the protection of a rules-based international order, for the protection of universal human rights, for the protection of those under assault that we have referenced thus far, for the protection of our democracy's national security and integrity from foreign Beijing threat and the like. Number two, the proposal recently initiated by, among others, the chair of our Foreign Affairs Committee in Canada, Michael Levitt, along with other Foreign Affairs Committees, for a UN special envoy to protect the rights and freedoms of the Hong Kong people. Third, the need to hold the CCP, and I always want to distinguish between the Chinese Communist Party, its leadership, and the people of mainland China and others who are the targets, the Chinese who are the targets of this unrelenting repression. And what we are witnessing as a dramatic case study of it, for which they must be held accountable, is the incarceration of 1 million Uyghurs in detention, their abuse in forced labor, the assaults on their traditions and their religion, the whole constituting what the editor of the Washington Post has called it, every day is Kristallnacht for the Uyghurs, and one of the worst atrocity crimes of the 21st century. And Nuri has described this compellingly in his remarks. An end to the prosecution and persecution of the Falun Gong, the criminalization in an ongoing way of their belief system, of their belief in truth and compassion and tolerance. And they have been the primary victims of illegal organ harvesting, which a recently established China Human Rights Tribunal under the chairmanship of Jeffrey Nice referred to as crimes against humanity being committed against the Falun Gong and others who've been the targets. And this has included the Uyghurs here as well. Number five, an end to the displacement and dispossession and repression of Tibetans and the menacing of the Taiwanese. We need to stand together with Tibetans and Taiwanese, just as we continue and must stand together with our fellow Democrats and the people of Hong Kong, with the persecuted Falun Gong, and with those who are threatened and whom Beijing lists as the 5 poisons, but whom we have to relate to and organize with and protect as the 5 protections. Number 6, hold Beijing accountable for the massive assault on media freedom described earlier, which is the fulcrum for a rules-based democratic order, as well as for the respective democracies. Number 7, protect the integrity of our international institutions under increasing disproportionate and prejudicial influence by Beijing, be it the WHO, the World Bank, WTO, the UN Human Rights Council, and others. Number 8, impose, and reference has been made to this, so I'll just mention just briefly, impose targeted Magnitsky sanctions on human rights violators to protect the people of Hong Kong and others under assault. Let us remember that Magnitsky sanctions are not directed against any particular country or government. They're directed against the gross human rights violators, and we must stand in solidarity with their victims through the targeted Magnitsky sanctions. Number 9, an independent, impartial, comprehensive investigation of the CCPs responsible for the spread of the pandemic and the utilization of a panoply of remedies that are available for that purpose. And finally, we need an effective international alliance of the now wokened community of democracies, those who up to now have unduly indulged or acquiesced in or turned a blind eye to these massive human rights violations. It's our responsibility now to seek justice for the victims and accountability for the violators. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Erwin. That was, as always, Erwin, that was great. Senator Kitching, you're up.
Thank you very much, Terry. And firstly, thank you to Emily for giving us a very clear and passionate view of what is going on in Hong Kong. Obviously, Australia is we keep abreast of issues in Hong Kong because we have a large expatriate community in Hong Kong, but also because we worry that in some ways, perhaps Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang. These are the canaries in the coal mine. And we do worry and keep abreast of those issues. And in fact, the Australian Parliament is sitting at the moment, and I have just come from the Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, where we were receiving a briefing, you'll be pleased to know, Terry, partly on the Victorian government, so a state government's signing of an MOU and an enhanced trade agreement under the BRI platform. Obviously, in Australia, there has been a shift in how we view our bilateral relationship with China. We are very trade exposed to China. So there has been a great deal of interest. And I think even a year ago, if you walked down the street and asked someone, you know, what their view on China was or their view on the Chinese Communist Party, you would not have had, you know, maybe not everyone would have had a view, but now I think you could ask any person, you know, in Collins Street in Melbourne or Pitt Street in Sydney or regional centres of Australia, you could ask them what they think. And I think everyone would now have a view. I think that in Australia, partly this is due to the pandemic. So there was a great outcry about the fact that Chinese-owned entities here were taking PPE, so the personal protective equipment, which we needed in our hospitals, and they were sending it back to China. So those companies, for example, Greenland and Risland, were sending that you know, necessary equipment back into the Chinese mainland. And I think a lot of Australians were very disturbed and very angry about that occurring, because obviously our healthcare workers needed that equipment here. So that sort of has fostered what is, I think, a suspicion of whether China was acting as a good global citizen in that regard. I do want to sort of talk perhaps a little about the Australian view on the CCP, on China. As I've said, we're quite economically exposed. We sell a lot of iron ore. But what I think is that, in fact, no one really trades because they're doing a favour to us. So, you know, even though China in the last week, or I really should say properly, Beijing in the last week has come out and said, you know, obviously tourism, you know, Australia is, you should be very careful about visiting Australia because there's anti-Chinese activity. You should think about being a tourist. In recent days, there's been, China has put out, Beijing has put out media releases about whether students should study in Australia. We have a very large cohort of Chinese full fee paying students in our tertiary institutions. But you know, our view is that that really people don't trade because they're doing a favour. China does not buy our iron ore because they think, oh, those lovely people in Australia are going to, you know, they're so nice, we're going to buy their iron ore. They're doing it because they need it. And in fact, iron ore has hit a very high, it's over $100 a tonne at the moment. So, you know, that we are trade exposed though, and a lot of our companies do have trade with China. But this is also a country where I think there's a view broadly that we should engage in values-based engagement with China. And I think that has to be front and foremost. And I think in the Australian Parliament, certainly there has been a view and a movement. Those are just the division bells ringing, so just ignore those. But in Australia, there has been, I think, a deepening awareness, and in the Australian Parliament, certainly from an extradition treaty, which we rejected. So I was actually on the Treaties Committee. That committee rejected having an extradition treaty with China. A lot of that was across the board. So the then Foreign Minister was quite keen on that, but the backbench of the government and every party represented, so including the Greens political party, obviously the ALP, the Australian Labor Party, we banded together and said, no, we don't want an extradition treaty in a country where we would not we don't recognise as having a rule of law that we would be comfortable extraditing people to. There were also questions, and Emily probably knows this better than most, questions about whether China would recognise their citizens who had renounced their Chinese citizenship, become Australian citizens. There was a view that the Beijing would not recognise that change in citizenship status, and certainly there was lots of evidence adduced from Hong Kong and the view of people living in Hong Kong and Hong Kong citizens. So we said no to that, and I think from there's been a view in the Australian Parliament that we have to ensure that there is a rules-based and values-based engagement with China. I personally remember in 2009, the Melbourne International Film Festival showed a documentary about Rebia Kadir, a Uyghur woman, a leader in the Uyghur community. The 10 Conditions of Love was a documentary on her, and the Chinese consulate in Melbourne proposed that film be removed from the program of the Melbourne Film Festival. I thought this was outrageous. Our system depends on people being able to view, to having certain freedom of thought, being able to view things and actually reach their own conclusion. So the value of critical thinking that we hold so dear, I think, in Western liberal democratic societies was obviously not something that the Chinese consulate was celebrating. And but that really, I think, was a wake-up call for me personally about how the CCP was willing to operate. And also, obviously, we've had instances in our tertiary institutions where China has sort of used economic clout to try to say that certain maps displaying Taiwan as a country should not be on walls in a tertiary institution, or suggestions around curricula. And I think that we can't tolerate that. I mean, our system for 800 years at the very minimum has relied on having, the Socratic method. It's relied on critical thinking, and really you could take that back a couple of millennia to those who gathered, on the Acropolis to discuss philosophy. And I very strongly believe in that that strengthens our system. And I don't think that another country should be able to come in and tell us what we should be teaching in our universities, for example. And I think there's been a bit of a pushback in the Australian community about that as well. I might leave it there. I'm happy to discuss the Victorian governments, the BRI as well, but maybe we'll do that in questions, Terry, or do you want me to talk about it now?
I think it'll come up, so we could move to Carl. Carl Gershman with the National Endowment of Democracy. Let's hear from you, Carl.
Thanks very much, Terry. It's great to be with all of you. I know time is short, so I want to make just 3 points. The first is that not only is a Chinese lab the source of the virus, and there's been controversy over this, but just recently, a Chinese official admitted, in effect, that it was. What happened was that, when Secretary Pompeo accused China of destroying samples of the virus on January the 3rd as a cover-up, an official of the China's National Health Commission, which had ordered the destruction of these samples, said that it wasn't done as a cover-up. It was done, but it was not done as a cover-up. It was done, he said, because if laboratory conditions cannot meet the requirements for the safe preservation of the samples should be destroyed on the spot or transferred to a professional institution for safekeeping. In other words, here you have a top official of the Chinese National Health Commission, which had ordered the destruction of the samples, basically saying that the conditions in the laboratories were not safe and they were not professional. And that's, obviously, this is where the virus came from. And in effect, he is admitting that. And not only that, but he made that statement on he said that the samples were destroyed on January 23rd. And it wasn't until 3 weeks later that China determined and set the policy to contain the virus. And there was a study done in the United Kingdom by the University of Southampton that said that if Beijing had acted just 3 weeks sooner, and they delayed more than 3 weeks, but it was 3 weeks from the destruction of the samples, had they acted just 3 weeks sooner, the number of COVID cases might have been reduced by 95%, which would have prevented a pandemic. In other words, in effect, China admitted that it's the source of the virus, and also there is studies done showing that its delay in dealing with this problem is the source of the pandemic, which is sweeping the world. It is a catastrophe that's sweeping the world. And my second point is that though China was clearly the source of this terrible international catastrophe, it has shown, not only has it shown no remorse with a willingness to cooperate with the international community to deal with the consequences of this terrible pandemic, but it has used the pandemic as a cover to engage in more aggressive international activity. And we've heard already from Emily Lau about what it has done in Hong Kong, arresting Martin Lee and 14 other leaders of the democracy movement, passing this National Security Act, which violates Article 22 of the Basic Law, prohibiting Beijing from interfering in the internal affairs of Hong Kong, which a coalition of 760 parliamentarians and public officials has termed a flagrant violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And they did this because they thought that the United States and others were so preoccupied with this virus that they created, that gave them the freedom to behave in this kind of aggressive way. And they're also stepped up their aggression in the South China Sea, creating 2 new administrative districts in contested areas, named 80 geographical features there. And this is the first time they've done anything like this since 1983. And they sent warships off the waters of Vietnam and Malaysia. And they've also escalated the threats against Taiwan, dropping the term peaceful in describing the China's approach to resolving the differences with Taipei, which is a departure from nearly 30 years of precedent in China policy, all again under the cover of the world's preoccupation with this virus that China has created. And of course, it's also engaged in bullying with its aggressive wolf warrior diplomats, threatening a boycott of Australian beef and wine after Australia called for an independent international investigation of the origins of the virus. It's also threatened Sweden after Swedish Penn. The senator has just been talking about the way they interfere in the internal affairs of countries. Swedish Penn agreed to award its Freedom of Speech Prize to a Chinese-born Swedish citizen living in Hong Kong. And China said that they would suffer serious consequences for doing something like that. So instead of showing remorse and cooperating, they're behaving in a much, much more bullying and aggressive way than ever before, because they feel that the world is incapable of responding to them because of the virus. But my final point is that China, in my view, and the regime, I'm talking about the regime, not the country, not the people, the CCP, the regime in Beijing, they are deeply insecure because they suffer from what Columbia University scholar Andy Nathan has called a birth defect that it cannot cure, which is that its dictatorial system lacks legitimacy. And this is why Xi Jinping, at the very beginning of his reign, in 2012 tasked the Communist Party to write the secret communique that has been leaked eventually, and it was called Document Number 9, which directed the party cadres to intensify the struggle against the core principles of liberal democracy, constitutional government, universal values, civil society, and free media. And they repeatedly refer to these principles as Western, but obviously the Taiwan is the fact that it is a democracy shows that these principles are perfectly compatible with Confucian culture and are therefore universal. And this, of course, is the same message that is conveyed today by the people of Hong Kong. We've just heard from Emily Lau about that, and 3 decades ago by the people of China in Beijing's Tiananmen Square and in 400 other cities across the country. China fears these universal values and human rights, and therefore it wants to absorb Taiwan and is engaged in an effort to weaken and divide these values within the entire international system. And it wants to take over an integrated international order where the norms within that liberal international system, which we have known for some now, are replaced by China's preferred values of absolute state sovereignty and control. At the end, I just want to say that this places a special priority on renewing the defense of the values of freedom and human rights for all people. The battle that is now underway with Beijing and the CCP has many dimensions, some of them military, economic, and technological. But it's fundamentally a struggle over political ideas and values. And in that struggle, our best allies are the lawyers, the journalists, the professors, the religious believers, the minority rights advocates, and other in China who, like Liu Xiaobo, want to end what he called the enemy mentality of the regime that poisons our goal to end the enemy mentality of this regime and to replace it with a country that is respectful of democratic rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. There's a number of questions that are coming in. Most of them seem to be fairly, although they seem to be fairly straightforward in their interest in exactly what kind of policy prescriptions we might realistically fight for in the liberal democracies to appropriately respond to the CCP's tearing up, essentially, of the Sino-British Hong Kong Treaty, the conditions of the Uyghurs, the persecution of Falun Gong. How do we hold China accountable for its lack of transparency in the matter of the pandemic? Now, as a journalist for much of the last 3 months, I have been spending a heck of a lot of time trying to get at the question of the origin of this particular beta coronavirus that has us all hiding like mole people around the world right now. And I wouldn't say that that it's a slam dunk case against the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I would also say it's immaterial, because what we know is unimpeachable about China's, Beijing's delays, its obfuscations, its misleading statements, its denials that have led to this international crisis. The World Health Organization, through a resolution at the World Health Assembly a couple of weeks ago, is committed to at some point having some kind of a review that will include an independent investigation, although it's to be conducted in tandem with the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is another one of the UN agencies that's more or less controlled by China. So I would like the panelists, when they're addressing the question of exactly what kind of policy responses we can realistically hope for and fight for in the liberal democracies, to address all of these transgressions from international human rights norms and decency committed by Beijing. And I'd like to begin with Ms. Lau, Emily Lau, and if you can, Ms. Lau, if you can precede your comments and your responses to these questions, if you could address, there are upcoming elections in Hong Kong for the Legislative Council in, I think, September. I was in Hong Kong after the last round of Legislative Council elections, and the Democrats that I spoke to were quite disheartened. The prospects this time around might be a little bit better, but you still don't have universal suffrage or anything quite like it. And I'm wondering, you mentioned and you insisted and stressed that we shouldn't understand the Hong Kong democracy movement as being secessionist or separatist. But how easy is it now to hold on to that case, given the kind of despair that so many of the young Democrats are facing, many of whom seem to be saying, we've got no hope unless we can somehow break free of the People's Republic of China. So I'm going to turn it over now, if I may, to Emily.
Thank you, Terry. You're right to refer to the Legislative Council election in September, but many people fear that many of the candidates would be disqualified from standing, or even if they were elected, they would still be disqualified. And these things have happened before. And particularly, they will use the national security law to disqualify the candidates and the elected legislators. And you're also right in talking about some of the people's desire for independence. If you look at the demonstrations last night, there were still people, and some were young people, holding up banners saying they want independence for Hong Kong. And so, well, what's going to happen if the election can go ahead? Will some pro-independence candidate, will they be allowed to stand? And if they were, will they be elected? And so there is a lot of discussion and debate, but I still think that many Hong Kong people, they want China to keep the promise of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, and under one country, two systems. But if China continues to crack down on us in such a heavy way, then it will push more people to say they want independence. So I hope the world will support peaceful demonstrations, and I hope that people will not be pushed to do these things, because if there is a big independence movement rising up in Hong Kong, then there would be even more repression and persecution from China. But in terms of what the world can do or should do, I think I agree with Senator Kitchen that engagement is necessary, but it should be rules-based and value-based. And I'm very pleased to see this international alliance of parliamentarians set up. And I hope more countries who believe in democracy and human rights will be willing to speak out. But as we speak, I think you know of some countries who are quite timid because their business sector is having a lot of influence on the government. And Australia or Canada or even the US and other places have been very, well, you can say infiltrated, but there are many Chinese students, Chinese people working, studying there, and it creates a lot of problems with the local people. And the Confucius Institute, some countries like Sweden, they've closed down all of them. And so I think we should tell the Chinese government and the CCP, you're right, we should make a difference between the communist regime and the people. We should tell the Communist Party to stop interfering in other people's affairs and to accept and to abide by the rules of the civilized world. But it needs a lot of courage, because finally, my last word, because some of the politicians, the academics, the business people of your countries, they have gone to China to work as their consultants, to teach the Communist Party how to deal with your own countrymen, to deal with your own government. Why? Because of money. China knows many people love money. So you tell me, how can we resolve that problem? Thank you, Terry.
I gotta say, Madam Lau, I would follow you into the gates of hell. I really appreciated those comments, and it's interesting. If I can ask Erwin to address this specifically, and I think we should be pretty candid about this difficulty of the influence of money and how it came to pass that the government in Beijing came to regard the Liberal Party, to its dismay, I think, ultimately, as the political wing of the Canada-China Business Council. But there has been, in just the last couple of days, the Australian Strategic Institute, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, just published a paper about what Ms. Lau just eloquently described on the work of the United Front Work Department in various liberal democracies around the world, how they capture the business community, the political class, academics. It's written by Alex Josky. It's quite remarkable. So it's kind of a struggle on a number of fronts here. And Erwin, please proceed on the question of how we might more specifically hold China accountable for the lack of transparency at the pandemic level and all of its other human rights transgressions. But if you would, and if you could, address it in the context of that kind of subversive influence that Ms. Lau was mentioning.
Well, I think that subversive influence was actually itself addressed a not too well report, but came out of the newly established National Committee on Security and Intelligence of Parliamentarians, which identified, Beijing's foreign threat and infiltration into Canada, whether it be the university culture, the parliamentary institutions, and the like. And reference was made to the International Alliance of Parliamentarians on China. Kimberly is a co-chair from Australia for that, and I'm one of the co-chairs from Canada. And this is the first alliance, and the first within that, protecting against the atrocity of the Uyghurs. So two of the things that we've been priorities for this parliamentary alliance. And while the parliamentary alliance reflects to use the term now, a woken parliamentary alliance, we need a woken governmental alliance. As I mentioned, I think the governments of the Western democracies have been unduly indulgent, acquiescent, turning a blind eye to, whether for commercial reasons or otherwise. But we now have to put the protection of universal human rights, the protection of democracy and democracy movements in Hong Kong, the protection of minorities, the protection of media freedom, protection of political prisoners. And Canada has had a series of Canadians who have been abducted, arrested, detained, tortured in detention, and imprisoned with the CCP believing that it can do these things with impunity. What I think has been very revealing is that a recent public opinion poll showed that more than 80% of Canadians, and this has been a dramatic shift in Canadian public opinion, and I suspect, from what Kimberly has been saying, that it would be reflected in the other democracies, that some 80% of Canadians no longer trust the Chinese regime, understand that what we're dealing with here is a predatory regime that is engaged both in the massive repression of its own citizens and the export of its aggression abroad. And that's why we need a coalition of governments coming together, not just an alliance of parliamentarians, but an alliance of the governments who these parliamentarians represent, so that we can have, at this point, an alliance of the community of democracies at the governmental level, joined with parliamentarians and civil society to hold the Beijing regime to account. Frankly, they have been able to not only continue their repression, but to do so with impunity. The time has come for justice and accountability.
Thanks very much, Erwin. I just wanted to say I didn't mean to sound as though I was singling out the Liberal government of Canada. It just happens that the Liberal Party is the government of Canada right now. That's also now, Senator Kitching. If you could address this this fundamental question in the context, Australia seems to actually be kind of out in front right now, and you guys have got a free trade agreement with China. You know, you're really heavily dependent on trade with China, unlike Canada. Something like 3.9% of our exports go to China, and we have a trade imbalance of 75-25%. The Australians seem to be kind of out in front on this issue and have been, you know, you've passed recent legislation dealing with foreign interference. Your foreign, what is it? You'll tell us the legislation. I wonder if you could share a little bit of that experience with us and talk to us about what kind of example Australia might be setting or might be able to set in that respect.
The Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. So what this was a bipartisan, obviously brought by the Conservative government, the government of the day currently in Australia, but supported by the Labor opposition. And there was a view that we didn't want influence in our political system, obviously, and also in other institutions in Australia. We had seen, so for example, the Australian Parliament's email system has been subject to a number of cyber security breaches. It's been hacked. Now, while we don't really have a policy of attribution, it's well known that that there are very few people who could carry out, very few state, it has to be a state actor because of the sophisticated nature of the denial of service, so the cybersecurity breaches. And it's been reported that in 2011, China was in the Parliament, the Australian Parliament's systems for a couple of years. And then we've had more recent breaches as well of our parliamentary systems. Obviously, people here don't take very kindly to another country doing that. So I think this was part of the wake-up call. We also were aware from the French elections and the American elections that there had been, there'd been, well, attempts to influence on social media in those elections. So we took the step of having the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme. That's run out of our Attorney General's department here in the Commonwealth. So I think that's been good. We've recently tightened up our foreign investment review panel that we have, the FIRB, the Foreign Investment Review Board, and National Security. In fact, this has happened in the last week. National Security has become a much stronger feature under which one can deny foreign investment. Now, this is a blind test across the board, but there was a lot of concern about the leasing for 99 years of the Port of Darwin to Landbridge, a Chinese company. And obviously, if there was ever to be a conflict scenario, the Port of Darwin would be obviously very important. It currently, in Darwin, we host a few thousand US Marine Corps personnel as well, and and more strength to their arm, Semper Fi. But that port is obviously critical infrastructure, and it was leased. So it was leased by the Northern Territory government. But now that would not be possible for a state government or a territory government here in Australia to enter into those arrangements. So I think there's a tightening on many levels and in many avenues here in Australia partly because we're aware of it, because we are, there is a lot of trade, there is a lot of backwards and forwardsing. We have a lot of full fee paying students from China. Our tertiary sector is reliant, it gets a lot of money from billions of dollars from those students. So we are very aware of that and the effect on our economy.
You've been great. And this is exactly the kind of thing that people need to hear. I'm just being told we've only got 4 minutes left.
Oh, really?
So unfortunately, I want to hear more. But Carl, you've got about 3.5 minutes, I think, Carl, to talk to us about the importance of international solidarity and these kinds of alliances. Yeah.
I want to just try to lay out what I think is a comprehensive policy here. I think we do need a political dimension to the struggle here, but I also want to underline the fact that we need a policy of deterrence. What China is doing, threatening to invade Taiwan, what it's doing in the South China Sea, its conflicts with India today. We need countries, governments to get together in alliances, and we need an effective policy of deterrence to avoid some very dangerous things that China could do. And they have to be told right now, and this comes a lot from the United States, but other countries have to be part of that. And the United States has to work with its allies in Asia and in elsewhere in the world to deter China. But in addition to that, I was struck that Emily used the term engagement is necessary. And I understand that. She also worried, that, people would, because of the economic interests that they have, that they were allowing China to penetrate into their own countries. And you have this report that was mentioned from the Australia Strategic Policy Institute about the work of the United Front Work Department. I think this reminds me of something that during the Cold War, when Kissinger had his policy of détente, and I'll use that for the moment as an equivalent of what Emily meant by engagement, because it's in the current world, it's hard not to engage with China. But we said at the time, a lot of us—
We've got about 2 minutes left.
Right. We need détente with freedom, and we need engagement with freedom. We have to counter this virus of appeasement because of China's economic influence. We have to prevent its interference in the internal affairs of countries to try to dictate what people can say about Tibet or about the Uyghurs or about any issue having to do with China. We have to fight back. And we also, and then this gets back to Liu Xiaobo and my point about human rights and democracy, we have to show solidarity with those people in China, not give up on them. That's where the essence of the struggle is. Liu Xiaobo said 15 years ago that if China rose as a dictatorship, he was warning the world, if China rose as a dictatorship, it would threaten liberal democracy all over the world. And Emily mentioned before that people didn't understand that. They thought that China would rise and become more liberal. But it's very, very dangerous. And right now, this is a hinge moment in international politics today. And we have to come together around a policy which is going to both deter China, but also support the people of China to achieve their freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Senator Kitching. Thank you, Erwin. Thank you, Emily. And thanks, everybody, for listening. I think that wraps it up for us.
Thank you.